The moment my thumb lifted off the glass, the air left the room. It wasn't a dramatic gasp. It was a vacuum, a sudden, violent silence where my heartbeat used to be. I stared at the screen, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in the darkened window of my 42nd floor office, watching the little progress bar zip to completion. Delivered. It was 2:14 a.m. The timestamp mocked me. But the name at the top of the chat thread mocked me worse. It didn't say Dr. Eris, my therapist who accepted voice memos for our Tuesday sessions. It said Claire, custom desk vendor. I had just sent a raw 3-minute audio file detailing my complete emotional collapse to the woman building my office furniture. I tried to unsend it, my fingers slipping on the sleek screen, but the network signal in the high-rise was too fast, too efficient. The message sat there, a gray audio bubble, innocent and devastating. To understand why that audio file was a catastrophe, you have to understand the architecture of my life. I am a senior accountant at one of the city's top firms, a title that implies prestige but mostly involves living inside a spreadsheet while the rest of the world sleeps. My existence is defined by grids, by the relentless logic of debits and credits, by the absolute necessity of everything balancing out to zero. I am the person who fixes the mess, who finds the missing millions, who ensures the structural integrity of other people's fortunes. I don't make mistakes. I certainly don't send late-night confessions to vendors. But the exhaustion had a texture that night. It wasn't just being tired. It was a vibration in my hands that wouldn't stop. The server room down the hall hummed with a low-frequency drone that seemed to rattle my teeth. I could taste the stale acidity of my 5th coffee, cold in the mug, and the recycled air of the office felt thin, like it had been breathed by 1,000 panicked people before me. I had been working on the fiscal year-end audit for 19 days straight, sleeping in 4-hour bursts, eating vending machine protein bars. I had become a machine, efficient and numb, but machines have breaking points. The voice note wasn't about the audit. If it had been just about the workload, I could have laughed it off as professional venting. But I was past complaining about hours. The recording was about the hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with numbers. I had whispered into the microphone about touch starvation. I had admitted, in a voice that cracked and wavered, that I didn't want to be the one handling everything anymore. I wanted to be handled. I wanted the heavy, grounding pressure of someone else's hands on me, quieting the noise. I wanted to be held until the vibration stopped. It was a plea for physical intimacy from a woman who hadn't been touched in months, sent to a woman whose only job was to measure my workspace for walnut and steel. I must have passed out in my chair after the panic subsided into a dull dread, because the next thing I knew, the sun was cutting a sharp orange line across the carpet. It was 6 a.m. My phone was face up on the desk, the screen bright. A notification sat there, simple and terrifying. Played, the heat that rose up my neck was instantaneous. It started at my collarbones and flooded my face, a prickling, suffocating wave of humiliation. She had heard it. Claire, the woman with the calm eyes and the sawdust on her boots, had listened to me beg for comfort at 6 a.m. She had heard the break in my voice. She knew that the senior accountant, who barked orders about invoice discrepancies, was actually a lonely, touch-starved wreck who cried into her phone in the middle of the night. I stood up, my legs shaky, the urge to flee so strong it made my stomach turn. I could call in sick. I could quit. I could move to a different state and change my name. The professional mask I wore, the tailored suits, the sleek bun, the clipped, efficient tone, hadn't just slipped. It had shattered. There was no way to glue it back together before the workday started. Then, the computer chimed. A calendar reminder popped up in the corner of my dual monitors, cheerful and oblivious to my internal apocalypse. 7 a.m. Final desk measurement. Claire. She was going to be here. In 45 minutes. I was going to have to look her in the eye in this glass box of an office, while the echo of my own desperate voice hung between us. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, eyes rimmed with red, blouse wrinkled, hair escaping its pins. I didn't look like a senior accountant. I looked exactly like the woman on the tape. And I had less than an hour to build the walls back up before she walked through the door. The elevator chime at exactly 6:58 a.m. didn't sound like a convenience. It sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. I had spent the last 40 minutes splashing freezing water on my face in the executive washroom, trying to scrub away the evidence of my breakdown. But you can't wash away the truth when it's been recorded and delivered to a stranger's inbox. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, my back rigid, pretending to study the grid of the city below, waiting for the inevitable collision of my two worlds. The morning light was harsh, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air. Dust that felt like it was settling in my lungs, choking me. When the glass doors slid open, Claire didn't just walk in, she occupied the space. In a building defined by polished chrome, Italian wool suits, and the silent, frantic hum of commerce, she was an anomaly of earth and texture. She stopped in the doorway, scanning the room. She was wearing work boots, high-quality leather, scuffed at the toes, and dark denim that made a soft, swishing sound in the quiet room. A flannel shirt was rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms that looked capable of lifting more than just numbers. There was a faint dusting of sawdust on her shoulder, a tiny constellation of maple or walnut that looked alien against the sterile gray carpet. The silence that stretched between us was thicker than the glass walls. I turned, forcing a smile that felt like it was made of brittle plastic. "Claire," I said. My voice was too high, too bright. "You're early." I was trying to channel the senior accountant, the woman who eats spreadsheets for breakfast, but I felt like a fraud in a costume. Claire didn't return the smile. She didn't offer a platitude. She just looked at me. Her eyes were a calm, deep hazel, unhurried and terrifyingly perceptive. They didn't scan my outfit or my office. They went straight to the tension in my jaw, the tremor I was hiding by gripping my own elbows. "Traffic was light," she said simply. Her voice was low, a warm alto that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. She set her tool bag down, a heavy canvas thing that clanked with the promise of manual labor, and pulled out a tape measure. "I assume you got the specifications?" I stammered, avoiding the real subject. "For the grommets." It was a stupid thing to say. Of course she had the specifications. She designed the damn thing. "I got everything you sent," Claire said, not looking up as she extended the metal tape. She didn't emphasize the word everything, but she didn't have to. The implication hit me in the chest like a physical blow. She moved around the space with an efficiency that mesmerized me. She wasn't frantic. She didn't rush. She moved like someone who understood that rushing only leads to mistakes. I watched her hands. They were broad, capable hands, nails cut short and clean, skin slightly roughened by work. I watched the muscles in her forearm flex, and a traitorous thought flashed through my panic. Those are the hands I asked for. She needed to measure the clearance near where I was standing. "Excuse me," she murmured, stepping into my personal space. I should have moved away. I should have retreated to the safety of the hallway. But I froze. She leaned past me to reach the wall outlet. Suddenly, the sterile smell of recycled air and ozone was gone, replaced by something rich and grounding. She smelled like shaved cedar and beeswax, like rain on hot pavement, like a forest growing in the middle of a concrete desert. It was intoxicating. For a second, just a split second, her shoulder brushed against my silk sleeve. The heat of her body radiated outward, a solid, undeniable warmth that made me want to close my eyes and lean into her. I stopped breathing. The vibration in my hands paused. In the orbit of her calmness, my chaos quieted. She pulled back, the tape measure snapping shut with a sharp click that broke the spell. She walked to my desk and placed a folded invoice on top of my perfectly aligned stack of files. "I'll need to verify the stain samples next week," she said, meeting my eyes again. There was no judgment there, only a heavy, quiet understanding that terrified me more than anger would have. She turned and walked out. I reached for the invoice she'd left. It was standard, printed on heavy stock, but there was handwriting at the bottom in thick black ink. I read it, and the breath I'd been holding left me in a rush. It didn't say, "per our conversation." It said, "I used to scream into my pillow. Recording it is more efficient." 3 days later, I found myself standing outside a converted warehouse in the industrial district, telling myself this was strictly business. I had convinced my boss that I needed to approve the wood stains for the new executive suite personally to prevent any supply chain bottlenecks. It was a lie, of course. A flimsy, transparent excuse constructed to justify why I was leaving the financial district in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The truth was, the silence in my apartment had become too loud, and the memory of cedar and beeswax was the only thing that seemed to cut through the static in my head. The sign on the rusted metal door was small and unpretentious. C.H. Joinery. I pushed it open, and the sensory shift was so abrupt it made me dizzy. I was leaving a world of recycled air, blue light, and hermetically sealed glass for a world that felt violently, beautifully alive. The air inside was thick and warm, carrying a golden haze of sawdust that caught the afternoon light streaming through the high, clear-story windows. It smelled of cured timber, tung oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of heated machinery. It was noisy, but not the frantic, high-pitched whine of the server room. This was a low, rhythmic thrum, the sound of creation rather than maintenance. Claire was at the far end of the cavernous space, her back to me. She was wearing noise-canceling headphones and standing over a massive workbench, guiding a power sander over a long slab of dark wood. The vibration of the machine seemed to travel through the concrete floor and up into the soles of my heels. I watched her for a moment before she sensed me. Her movements were a dance of economy. She leaned her weight into the wood, her shoulders shifting with a fluid power that made my own body ache with a sudden, sharp awareness of its own tension. She turned, seeing me, and killed the power to the sander. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was resonant. She pulled the headphones down around her neck, her hair messier than it had been in my office, a smudge of dark grease on her cheekbone. She didn't look surprised. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "I need to sign off on the walnut," I said, clutching my designer handbag like a shield. "Efficiency." Claire smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made my breath hitch. She wiped her hands on a rag tucked into her belt and walked toward me, closing the gap. "Right, efficiency." She gestured toward a pair of stools near a pot-bellied stove in the corner. "Coffee? It's sludge, but it's hot." We sat, and for the first time in years, I didn't check my phone. The atmosphere of the workshop acted like a Faraday cage, blocking out the signals of my frantic life. "Your note," I started, the words tumbling out before I could polish them. "You said you used to scream into pillows." Claire took a sip of her coffee, her eyes fixed on the dust motes drifting in a shaft of light. "I wasn't always a carpenter," she said quietly. 5 years ago, I was a corporate strategist for a logistics firm. I lived in airports and Excel. I had the corner office, the bonus structure, the ulcer. She looked at me, her gaze direct and uncomfortably intimate. "I know what the vibration feels like, Elena. I know what it's like to be so touch-starved that you hug your own knees in the shower just to feel something holding you together." Hearing my own secret reality spoken aloud by this woman in this sanctuary of amber light stripped me bare. I looked down at my hands, manicured and trembling. "How did you stop it?" "I stopped trying to be abstract," she said. She stood up and motioned for me to follow her back to the workbench. I needed to touch things that were real, things that had grain and resistance. She stopped in front of the massive slab she had been sanding. It was raw black walnut, the edges still live and rough, the surface a chaotic, beautiful map of dark swirls. "This is your desk," she said. "Or it will be." I reached out to hover my hand over it, conditioned by a lifetime of do not touch signs in museums and stores. No, Claire commanded softly. She reached out and took my wrist. Her grip was firm, her palm warm and rough against my cool skin. The shock of the contact went straight to my spine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she guided my hand down until my palm pressed flat against the wood. Feel it. Don't just look at it. The wood was warm from the friction of the sander. It felt alive under my hand, silky where she had worked it, rough where the bark still clung to the edge. Claire's hand stayed on my wrist, her thumb resting on my pulse point. I could feel the steady, slow rhythm of her own heartbeat through her fingertips. Or maybe I was imagining it. The wood has a direction, she murmured, her voice right by my ear now. I hadn't realized she'd moved closer. If you fight the grain, it splinters. If you move with it, it becomes smooth. You've been fighting the grain for a long time. I stood there, trapped between the solid warmth of the wood and the radiating heat of her body. And for the first time in 19 days, my shoulders dropped. The tightness in my chest unspooled. I wasn't the senior accountant. I was just a body, standing in the dust, being anchored by a woman who understood the language of my exhaustion better than I did. When I finally left an hour later, stepping back into the gray noise of the city, I felt different. The vibration was still there, but it was quieter. And as I sat in the back of the car, I kept rubbing the palm of my hand, trying to hold on to the phantom sensation of rough walnut and the ghost of her touch. The workshop visit didn't close the loop. It opened a frequency I couldn't tune out. In the days that followed, the boundaries of our professional relationship began to dissolve, eroded by the digital intimacy of the late hours we both kept. The subject lines remained strictly professional. Invoice discrepancy, delivery schedule, grommet specifications. But the timestamps told a different story. We were communicating in the dead zone between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the witching hour for the sleepless and the obsessed. It started with a question about the finish on the modesty panel. I sent it at 2:17 a.m., expecting a reply the next business day. The response came 3 minutes later. Walnut needs to breathe, Elena, just like people. Are you breathing? I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking at the end of her sentence like a heartbeat. The server room hummed its low, monotonous note down the hall, a reminder of the machine I was trapped inside. I typed back, the blue light of the monitor washing out my pale skin, making my hands look ghostly on the keyboard. I can't breathe until the audit is done. If I stop, the structure fails. I am needed here. Her reply came fast, a pulsing ellipsis that held my breath hostage before the text appeared. Being needed is a transaction. It means you're useful. It means you're a tool that fits a specific slot in the machine. Being wanted is gravitational. It has nothing to do with utility. Do you know the difference? I read the words twice, then 3 times. The distinction settled in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. In my world, value was calculated by output. I was valuable because I was necessary. I was the load-bearing wall. The idea of being wanted, of being desired not for what I could fix, but for who I was in the quiet moments, felt foreign, almost reckless. I didn't know how to answer, so I deflected. What are you doing awake? Sanding, she wrote, smoothing out the rough edges on a piece of reclaimed oak. It's stubborn. It fights back. Tell me, I typed, the command slipping out before I could censor it. I wanted to know what her hands were doing. I wanted to be the wood. It's about friction and heat, she replied, her words painting a picture in the sterile silence of my office. You start with the coarse grit. You have to strip away the old varnish, the layers of protection that have hardened over time. It's aggressive work. You have to apply pressure until you get down to the raw grain. But then you switch to the finer grit. You move slower. You circle the knots instead of forcing through them. You keep going until the surface is so smooth it feels like skin, until it warms up under your palm and stops resisting. The description hit me with a visceral force. I lay back in my ergonomic chair, the leather cold against my neck, and closed my eyes. I imagined her hands, those broad, capable hands with the short nails, moving over me with that same deliberate intent. I imagined her stripping away the layers of senior accountant, the armor of silk and cynicism, until she found the raw, terrified woman underneath. I imagined the friction, the heat, the pressure of being held down and smoothed out until I stopped shaking. For the first time, I didn't see my body as a vehicle for caffeine and stress. I saw it as something that could be worked on, something that deserved care. I sat there in the dark, tracing the line of my own collarbone, wondering what it would feel like to be touched without an agenda, to be wanted, not just needed. But the world doesn't stop for late-night epiphanies. Just as the sun began to bleed gray light through the blinds, the spell broke. My second monitor lit up with a priority alert. The fiscal year-end deadline wasn't just approaching. It was here, a tidal wave of red flags and urgent demands. The audit partner was screaming for files I hadn't finalized. The reality of the glass box came rushing back, suffocating the fragile peace I had found in a text window. I closed the email thread with Claire, but the ghost of her words stayed on the screen, burning behind my eyelids. Friction and heat. I had to survive the day, but for the first time, survival didn't feel like enough. I wanted the sanding. I wanted the heat. And I was terrified that the coming storm would wash it all away before I ever got to feel it. The collapse didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a missing signature on the K-14 schedule. A semantic error. A nothing. But in the high-pressure cooker of the 42nd floor, a nothing becomes a catastrophe. Marcus, the managing partner, stood over my desk, his face a mottled purple, shouting about liability and negligence. His voice was a physical assault that drilled into my temples, vibrating against the bone. I stared at the spreadsheet. The numbers, usually my soldiers, my obedient little rows of logic, began to swim. They detached from the grid and floated, nonsensical and mocking. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't a figure of speech. My lungs had turned to stone. The air in the room was thick, viscous, impossible to pull in. I stood up. Marcus was still yelling, but the sound was underwater now, muffled, distant. "I need a moment," I whispered. I don't think he heard me. I walked out. I didn't go to the bathroom. The fluorescent lights there were too bright, too loud. I went to the stairwell, the concrete echo chamber. I sat on the cold step, put my head between my knees, and tried to find oxygen. It wasn't there. The walls were moving in, inch by inch, a crushing pneumatic press. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice before I could unlock it. I didn't open the therapist app. I didn't call my mother. My thumb found the thread that had been my lifeline for the past week. The thread with the woman who sanded rough edges until they were smooth. "I can't breathe," I typed. "The walls are touching." I stared at the screen, gasping like a fish on a dock. The 3 dots appeared instantly. "Coming. Go to the lobby. Now." I don't remember the elevator ride down. It was a blur of gravity and nausea. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the lobby was a chaotic swirl of couriers and security, but I saw her immediately. She was illegally parked in the loading zone, her beat-up pickup truck looking like a bruise against the pristine line of black town cars. She was standing by the passenger door, holding it open. She was wearing the flannel again, sleeves rolled up, and her face was set in a line of grim determination. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She saw me, saw the way I was holding myself together with invisible tape, and she nodded. A command. "Come here." I walked past the security desk without swiping out. I walked out the revolving doors, and the humidity of the city hit me. But then I was climbing into the cab of her truck. The smell hit me instantly, that sanctuary smell. Cedar, old coffee, dust. It filled my lungs, forcing the panic back just an inch. Claire slammed the door shut, sealing us in. She climbed into the driver's seat, put the truck in gear, and pulled into traffic without looking at me. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if I was okay. She knew I wasn't. She just drove. We wove through the gridlock, her hand steady on the gear shift. I watched her knuckles, white and tense, and realized she was angry. Not at me, for me. She drove aggressively, cutting off a taxi, forcing her way toward the bridge. We were leaving the city. "Breathe," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. I tried to obey. My breath hitched, a ragged, broken sound. "Again," she ordered, her voice low and grounding, vibrating against the panic in my chest. "Match my breathing." She exaggerated her own breaths, her chest rising and falling in the periphery of my vision. I latched onto her rhythm like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. In, hold, out. We crossed the bridge, the steel girders flashing by like the ribs of a giant beast, and the skyline began to recede behind us. The grip on my throat loosened. The static in my ears faded. We drove for 40 minutes in silence. It wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of the office. It was a companionable silence, a protective bubble. She took us west, away from the noise, up into the hills where the city was just a glittering scar on the horizon. She pulled into a gravel overlook, killed the engine, and finally turned to look at me. "You're shaking," she said softly. I looked down. My hands were vibrating in my lap. "I ruined the audit," I said, my voice sounding small and foreign. "I missed a file." "You didn't ruin anything," Claire said. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a thermos and a paper bag. "You survived a system designed to crush you. There's a difference." She opened the bag. It was a sandwich, a simple, messy thing from a deli. "Eat. Your blood sugar is crashed. I can hear your stomach from here." I took the food. I took a bite. And as the taste of bread and cheese hit my tongue, I started to cry. Not the silent, dignified tears of a martyr, but ugly, gasping sobs that shook the whole truck. Claire didn't look away. She didn't offer a tissue. She just sat there, a solid, unmoving presence in the storm, letting me break so she could help me put the pieces back together. The tears stopped eventually, leaving that raw feeling following a storm. I wiped my face with the rough napkin she'd provided, staring out the windshield. The city was a smear of light in the distance, a galaxy of anxieties that couldn't reach me here. Rain had started to fall, a soft, drumming rhythm on the metal roof. Outside smelled of wet asphalt. Inside, it was all leather, stale coffee, and that rich scent of cedar clinging to Claire like a second skin. "Better?" she asked, watching the rain streak the glass. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice rasping. "I feel empty." "Empty is good," Claire said, facing me, her knee brushing the gear shift. "When a vessel is full of poison, you have to dump it out before you can fill it with water." She turned the key just enough to roll down the windows a crack. Cool, damp air drifted in. "Do you hear that? The rain?" "No, the silence underneath it." She leaned back, eyes closing. "When I was in logistics, I heard a hum, all the time, a high-pitched whine behind my ears. It was the sound of everything I hadn't done yet. It got so loud I couldn't hear people talking." She opened her eyes, dark pools in the dashboard light. "I can still hear it on you, Elena. You're vibrating with it." I looked at my trembling hands. "I don't know how to turn it off. If I stop, everything falls apart." "That's the lie the machine tells you," she said softly. "The sun rises tomorrow, whether that spreadsheet balances or not." The air in the cab compressed, charged with electricity. She reached across the console. I stopped breathing, watching her hand, broad, scarred, capable, move toward me. I didn't flinch. I leaned into it. Her hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and warm. It wasn't a tentative pat. It was a claim. Her thumb pressed into the tight knot of muscle near my neck, digging in with a pressure that bordered on pain but felt like salvation. It was an anchor dropped into the churning sea of my panic. "Feel my hand," she instructed, her voice dropping to a rough whisper. Focus on the weight. Focus on the heat. Let everything else drop away. I closed my eyes. The hum in my head died, replaced by my heart's thudding. In that silence, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The voice memo. The confession I had sent at 2 a.m. I had said I wanted to be held. I had said I wanted to be handled. But I realize now, with her thumb working the tension out of my muscle, that I hadn't just wanted anyone. I wanted this. I wanted the sawdust and the calluses. I wanted the woman who saw the architecture of my burnout and didn't look away. I wanted Claire. The desire was no longer intellectual. It was a physical ache, sharper than panic. I turned my head slightly, my cheek brushing her wrist. The skin was soft there, contrasting with the roughness of her palm. I inhaled, filling my lungs with rain and cedar. "Claire," I whispered, her hand stilled. The tension coiled tight, a suspended wire ready to snap. She looked at my mouth, then my eyes. The air was thick with things unsaid. "We should go back," she said, but she didn't move her hand. "Before you get cold." "I've never felt warmer," I said, the truth burning me. She lingered for a heartbeat longer, a second that stretched into eternity, before slowly pulling away. The absence of her touch left a phantom weight I already missed. She put the truck in gear, jaw set tight, and turned us back toward the city. The drive back was different. The companionable silence had morphed into something dangerous, edged with razor blades. Every time she shifted gears, I watched the flex of her forearm. Every time the truck swayed, our shoulders bumped, sending sparks through my nervous system. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't the client anymore. She wasn't the vendor. We were two people orbiting a gravity well we were both terrified to fall into. As the city skyline rose up, I realized I was dreading the return to the glass box. Not because of the audit, but because it meant stepping out of her atmosphere and back into the vacuum. I wasn't sure I could survive the lack of oxygen anymore. The glass walls wouldn't just trap me now. They would suffocate me. The freight elevator arrived at 9 p.m. on a Friday, the bell echoing through the deserted floor like a church toll. The rest of the firm had gone home to their families, their drinks, their lives. I was the only ghost left in the machine, ostensibly catching up on the audit files, but in reality, I was waiting. When the doors slid open, Claire emerged, pushing a dolly stacked with heavy, dark slabs of walnut wrapped in moving blankets. She looked different tonight. The flannel was gone, replaced by a black tank top that clung to her frame, exposing the intricate map of muscles in her shoulders and the faint white scar running down her left tricep. She looked less like a vendor and more like an intruder, a force of physical reality invading my abstract world. "I told security I'd be a while," she said, not bothering with a hello. Her voice was rougher than usual, tired perhaps, or maybe just guarded. "This isn't IKEA furniture. It doesn't snap together." I stood by the window, arms crossed, trying to look like the client, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I'm not in a rush," I lied. I was in a rush. I was racing toward something I couldn't name, terrified of the impact. She set to work, and I became the audience to a performance I hadn't bought a ticket for, but couldn't look away from. She moved the existing generic particle board desk aside with a dismissive shove, clearing the space. Then she began to unpack the walnut. The smell hit me again, that rich, cured scent of timber and oil, colonizing the sterile air of my office. I watched her kneel on the carpet, her tool belt clinking softly. I watched the way her back muscles shifted under the black cotton as she reached for her drill. I watched the concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip as she aligned the steel legs. It was a competence kink I didn't know I had, manifesting in real time. There was something deeply, primally attractive about a woman who could build the world she wanted to live in, while I just managed the receipts for the one I was trapped in. "Elena," she said, not looking up. The sound of my name in her mouth made my stomach flip. I need a hand. This slab is top-heavy. I need you to stabilize the left side while I drive the bolts. I hesitated. I don't want to mess it up. You won't, she said. She looked up then, her eyes dark and serious. Come here. Put your hands on it. I walked over, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of my suit trousers be damned. I placed my hands on the cool, smooth edge of the walnut slab. She was close. Too close. I could smell the day's work on her, sawdust, sweat, and that underlining note of rain. The heat radiating from her bare arm was a physical weight against my side. Hold it steady, she instructed. Her voice was low, intimate. She positioned the impact driver. The sudden whir chunk of the tool driving the bolt home was violent and loud in the silence. She did it 3 times, efficient and brutal. Then she set the drill down, but she didn't move away. We were kneeling there, shoulder to shoulder, hands on the wood. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. It was thick with unspoken things. I didn't delete it, she said quietly. I froze. I didn't have to ask what she meant. Claire, please, it was a mistake. Was it? She turned her head. We were inches apart. I could count the eyelashes framing those hazel eyes. I've listened to it 4 times, Elena, not because I pity you, but because I recognized the tone. It's the sound of someone who is drowning in open air. I tried to pull my hands back, shame burning hot in my throat, but she caught my wrist. Her grip was gentle, but implacable. Don't run. You're always running. It was embarrassing, I whispered, the confession torn out of me. I sounded pathetic, begging to be held like a child. You didn't sound pathetic, Claire said, her thumb tracing the tendon in my wrist, sending shockwaves up my arm. You sounded honest. You said you wanted weight. You said you wanted to be handled because you were tired of holding up the sky by yourself. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me. The air between us crackled, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. When I heard it that night, she continued, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. I didn't think about the invoice. I didn't think about the contract. She paused, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, dark with intent. I looked at my keys, and I thought about driving down here at 3 a.m. I wanted to answer you. I wanted to be the hands you were asking for. The world narrowed down to the space between us. The server room hummed, the city lights blinked outside, but they were a million miles away. There was only the wood, the heat of her skin, and the terrifying realization that the safety of the professional boundary had just been incinerated. The drill sat silent on the carpet, a useless tool now that the real work had begun. I stopped breathing, waiting for the crash. The silence that followed her confession wasn't empty. It was a physical pressure, heavy and waiting to be broken. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic staccato rhythm that felt loud enough to shatter the glass walls around us. Claire didn't blink. She didn't retreat into an apology or smooth it over with a joke. She just held my gaze, her eyes dark with a terrifying amount of certainty, waiting for me to either run or collide. I didn't run. For the first time in my life, I didn't calculate the risk. I didn't forecast the fallout. I just let the air leave my lungs. Her hand moved. It wasn't a tentative gesture. It was a claim. The hand that had been gripping my wrist slid upward, mapping the tension in my forearm, crossing the sensitive skin of my inner elbow, and settling heavy and possessive on my waist. The contrast was shocking. The roughness of her calloused palm snagging against the smooth, expensive silk of my blouse. It was a tactile shock that short-circuited every logical pathway in my brain. The heat of her skin burned through the fabric, branding me. Elena, she whispered, and the name sounded like a question she already knew the answer to. I didn't answer with words. I stepped in. I closed the final inch of distance between us, my body colliding with hers, soft curves against solid muscle. When her mouth found mine, It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't polite. It was desperate. It tasted of stale office coffee and hesitation and the sudden violent release of 19 days of starvation. It was the taste of ruin, and it was the best thing I had ever felt. I made a sound, a broken, needy noise that I would have been mortified by an hour ago, and Claire swallowed it whole. Her other hand came up to tangle in the hair at the base of my neck, her fingers strong and demanding, tilting my head back to deepen the contact. I had spent my entire career being the structure, the pillar, the one who held everything up. But as Claire walked me backward until my hips hit the edge of the newly installed walnut desk, I felt the structure collapse. And it was a relief. I didn't have to hold myself up anymore. She was doing it. Her hands were everywhere, on my waist, my neck, my back, grounding me, holding me together with a solidity that spreadsheets never could. She lifted me effortlessly, sitting me on the edge of the desk she had just built. The wood was cool and smooth against my legs, a stark contrast to the heat of her body pressing between my knees. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders, burying my face in the crook of her neck, inhaling that scent of rain and cedar and sweat. I was shaking again, but it wasn't from panic. It was from the sheer, overwhelming sensory overload of finally being touched. "I've got you," she murmured against my skin, her voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. "I've got you. Let go." And I did. The tears came back, hot and fast, leaking into the collar of her black tank top. I cried for the exhaustion, for the loneliness, for the sheer relief of being handled. Claire didn't pull away. She just held me tighter, one hand rubbing slow, firm circles on my back, smoothing out the frantic energy until I went boneless against her. We stayed like that for a long time, the city lights blinking oblivious outside the glass. The senior accountant was gone. There was only Elena, unspooled and raw. "I wanted to touch you the first day," I whispered into her shoulder, the confession scraping my throat. "When you measured the wall, I almost reached out." Claire pulled back just enough to look at me, her thumbs wiping the tears from my cheeks. Her expression was open, unguarded. I know. I felt the static. It nearly knocked me over. She rested her forehead against mine. "I thought you were just stressed. Then I heard the recording and I realized you were hungry." "Starving," I corrected. A buzzing sound cut through the dark. It was angry, persistent, and entirely unwelcome. My phone, abandoned on the floor near the drill, was vibrating against the carpet. The screen lit up the ceiling with a harsh blue glow. I glanced down. Incoming call. Marcus, managing partner. The old reflex kicked in. The surge of adrenaline, the instinct to scramble, to answer, to apologize, to fix. My muscles tensed. I started to pull away, my hand reaching instinctively toward the floor. "Elena," Claire said. She didn't grab me. She didn't stop me. She just said my name, a quiet anchor in the room. I froze. I looked at the phone, vibrating like a trapped insect. Then I looked at Claire. I looked at the sawdust on her shoulder, the kindness in her eyes, the solid reality of her presence. I looked at the woman who had driven me out of the city to help me breathe. The phone buzzed one last time, then went silent. Missed call. I didn't pick it up. I turned back to Claire, took a breath that filled my lungs completely, and traced the line of her jaw with my thumb. "Let it go to voicemail," I said. The corner of Claire's mouth lifted in a slow, tired smile. She leaned in and kissed me again, softer this time, a seal on a new contract. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between us. The audit wasn't finished, but for the first time in years, the ledger felt balanced. The sun that rose over the city the next morning didn't feel like an interrogation lamp anymore. It felt like just sun. I walked into the lobby at 8 a.m. sharp, my hair pinned back into its severe chignon, my silk blouse pressed, my heels clicking the familiar staccato rhythm on the marble floors. To anyone watching, I was the same senior accountant who had left the building 18 hours ago. I swiped my badge, nodded at the security guard, and rode the elevator up in silence, watching the numbers climb. But underneath the tailored wool blazer, my skin still hummed with the phantom pressure of Claire's hands on my waist. I felt different, heavier, in a good way, grounded. When Marcus stormed into my office at 9:15, slamming a stack of P&L reports onto the new walnut desk, I didn't flinch. Usually, his entrance would spike my cortisol through the roof. I would be apologizing before he even opened his mouth, scrambling to fix problems I hadn't caused. Today, I just looked at him. I looked at the vein throbbing in his temple, the frantic energy radiating off him, and instead of fear, I felt a strange, detached, almost clinical pity. He was vibrating. He was drowning in the hum, and he didn't have anyone to drive him to the mountains to help him breathe. "I needed these yesterday, Elena," he barked, spit flying as he pointed a shaking finger at the files. "The client is threatening to walk if we don't have the reconciliations. Why aren't these done?" I placed my hands flat on the desk. The dark, expensive wood was cool, solid, and unyielding. I could feel the grain under my palms, the microscopic ridges Claire had sanded but left just rough enough to be real. It was a direct line to the memory of the workshop, to the smell of rain and cedar. I remembered her voice in the truck. "The sun rises tomorrow, whether that spreadsheet balances or not." "You'll have them by 5, Marcus," I said. My voice was steady, low. It sounded like her. He blinked, stunned by the lack of panic. "I said noon." "And I said 5, I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "If you want them accurate, you'll wait. If you want them fast, you can do them yourself." The silence that followed was absolute. He stared at me, searching for the crack in the armor, but the armor was gone. I wasn't defending a fortress anymore. I was just standing my ground. He huffed, grabbed a single file, and walked out without another word, the glass door clicking shut behind him. I let out a breath, sinking into my ergonomic chair. My hands were still on the desk. This workspace didn't feel like a cockpit anymore. It felt like a foundation. Throughout the day, whenever the stress began to coil in my stomach, I would run my fingers along the edge of the wood, finding the spot where the live edge met the smooth finish. It was a tactile, secret reminder of the midnight installation, of the heat, of the way I had unraveled and been put back together. Claire returned at 4 p.m. for the final sign-off. The interaction was a masterclass in professional theater. She stood on the other side of the desk, clipboard in hand, wearing a clean flannel and her work boots, looking every bit the vendor. "Any issues with the installation?" she asked, her tone neutral, though her eyes were dancing with a private, dangerous amusement. "The structural integrity is excellent," I said, signing the invoice. I handed the clipboard back, making sure our fingers brushed. The spark was instantaneous, a secret jolt that traveled straight to my core. "Good," she said, tucking the pen behind her ear. "Walnut is resilient. It handles pressure well." "It does," I agreed, looking at her mouth, remembering the taste of coffee and desperation. "It just needs the right maintenance." She didn't smirk, but the corner of her eye crinkled. "I've got a rigorous maintenance schedule in mind. I'll text you the details." She left, and I sat there in the quiet office, the golden late afternoon sun turning the dust motes into gold. I realized then that the burnout hadn't just been about the hours or the difficulty of the work. It had been about the isolation. I had been a closed loop, overheating in my own friction. Now, there was a vent. There was an anchor. I wasn't quitting, not yet. I was good at this job, but I wasn't drowning in it anymore. My phone buzzed on the wood, the vibration dampened by the density of the walnut. "Claire, 8 p.m., my place. I'm making dinner. Bring wine. Red. Leave the spreadsheets." I smiled, picking up the phone. "On my way." Later that night, standing on her balcony in the cool night air, I opened my voice memo app. I pressed record, watching the audio wave ripple across the screen. "I used to think I needed silence," I whispered. Then I looked through the glass door at Claire, who was laughing at something on the TV, relaxed and real. I hit stop and deleted the file. I didn't need to record it anymore. I just opened the door and told her myself. If you enjoyed this story of accidental confessions and finding your anchor, please subscribe for more.